The sovereignty of God refers to God's rule over absolutely everything in this world. He is sovereign in his ruling over creation. The whole created order is held together in and by him. He is sovereign over the history of humans and nations. He directs everything down to the smallest detail. Does that make us robots? Absolutely not. Because the truth of God's sovereignty and our human responsibility are truths that are coordinate truths. They're not contradictory truths. They're truths that go together. They're not truths that fight against one another. And my favorite two examples of that, one in the Old Testament and one in the New Testament, the story at the end of Kings where Micaiah, the prophet, one of the last prophets of the Lord left alive in Israel, tells Ahab that if he goes up to Ramoth-Gilead to fight against his enemies there, he will be killed. And he does this after having received a vision from the Lord of exactly what is going to happen and prophesying that vision. And if you'll go back, and I just encourage those that are watching this to go back and read that passage, it's a beautiful blending of both the truth of God's absolute sovereignty and the responsibility of men. Ahab basically tries to thwart the prophecy by disguising himself and by letting Jehoshaphat go in dressed as the king. And the Syrian soldiers actually try and kill Jehoshaphat because they think he's the king of Israel. But we're told in that passage that a certain man pulled his bow, aimed it at random, and shot the king of Israel in the joint of his armor, and he died. And so it's a beautiful passage indicating that God's sovereign providence and control over that whole situation did not in any way compromise or contradict the human freedom of that man to just decide who he's going to shoot and pull a bow and fire the arrow, that both of those things work together. The other passage I love to point to is in the book of Acts, towards the end of the book of Acts, when Paul is shipwrecked. Paul, when they're on the ship, remember Paul's told the centurion that he shouldn't take the ship out in winter because if he does, there could be great loss and all of this. And sure enough, they get in a storm and they find themselves throwing things over the board. But the Lord comes to Paul and he says, Paul, you don't need to worry. I've heard your prayers, and I'm going to save the lives of every man on this ship. Well, later, the sailors are going to try and sneak away from the ships. Paul catches them lowering the boats and getting ready to leave the ship. And Paul goes, now this is after the Lord has said, Paul, I've heard your prayer, I'm going to save everybody on the ship. And Paul goes to the soldiers and he says, you see those sailors? They're getting ready to abandon ship. If they leave this ship, all of us will die. And so Paul's been told by the Lord that they're all going to live. He sees the sailors getting ready to leave the ship. He tells the soldiers, if they leave, we will all die. So the soldiers cut the ropes on the boats so that the sailors can't get off. And sure enough, after the storm, everybody's alive. They're all together. They're on the beach. But there's this beautiful blending of God's sovereignty and man's responsibility. Paul knows that God is in control, but he still says to the soldiers, if you don't cut those ropes, we're all going to die. So you find that throughout the Bible without apology. And maybe the supreme example is in Acts 2 and in Acts 4 when Peter says when Peter says to the gathered multitude there at Pentecost, and then later when the early Christians are praying in Acts chapter 4, they acknowledge that wicked men conspired together to put to death Jesus of Nazareth on the cross. And in the same verse, acknowledge that this was all according to God's sovereign appointment. Men of Israel, this man who was appointed by God, you nailed to the cross by the hands of wicked men, which God had appointed and foreordained before all time. It's this beauty, and no apology, no pause for a 40-minute explanation of how both of those things could be true at the same time. Just this glorious assertion that they were guilty for crucifying the Messiah, And that, by the way, this had been the plan, the stratagem of God for the redemption of mankind from before the foundation of the world. At the same time, God is sovereign. We're responsible. We're not robots. Our actions matter. Why do our actions matter? Because God, in His sovereignty, appoints means to accomplish His purposes. And very often, our choices, our desires, our actions are the means of God's appointment for the accomplishment of His will. Both are required.